Hello friends, Dr. David Katz again, another COVID reality check, this one all about hydroxychloroquine. In just the last day, my inbox is filled up with comments, questions about hydroxychloroquine. And some have been advocating for, some advocating against, everybody talking about the evidence. So let me get to that in a second. But just quickly, my sense about the flow of information during the pandemic is that it really is like flow in some whitewater river. Some of the water washes over us, it's everywhere for an instant, and then it's gone and it never comes back. But some of it gets caught up in eddies and currents and washes over us and wraps back around and washes over us again. And so clearly hydroxychloroquine is in one of those, and it keeps coming back around. Part of the reason is the uncertain state of the science. Part of the reason is that it's been highly politicized. And so I think some people have a vested interest in advocating for, some people have a vested interest in advocating against. The reason it seems to be everywhere again at the moment is because of a Newsweek piece by a professor at the Yale School of Public Health, Harvey Risch, who published a review and commentary in the American Journal of Epidemiology about early outpatient use of hydroxychloroquine in outpatients and summarized the relevant evidence. And this was earlier in the pandemic, but he wrote the commentary in Newsweek to refer back to his peer-reviewed paper and to argue that he still feels the same way. On the other hand, as we've all heard, the federal authorities have argued against the use of hydroxychloroquine, have highlighted the potential dangers, notably to the heart, where it can lengthen something called the QT interval and potentially lead to a fatal cardiac dysrhythmia called torsade de pointe. And we've heard that it's ineffective for treating hospitalized patients and so forth. What is the right answer here? Because you have highly credentialed people. Obviously, there are a lot of people out there just with opinions, and we tend to know what those are worth. Everybody has one, but they're not necessarily worth all that much. But there are a number of highly trained people in medicine, in hospital medicine, in emergency medicine, in epidemiology, microbiology weighing in, and they're weighing in on both sides of the argument. So what sense can we make of this? And that's the critical thing, making sense, because the science is uncertain. So here's my conclusion. I've done the best I can in the time available to look at all the relevant studies being cited, and I think the simple fact is we don't have definitive answers because different questions are being posed. The argument that Professor Risch is making is that there is an advantage in the use of hydroxychloroquine combined with azithromycin, an antibiotic, or doxycycline, an antibiotic, and many people would also argue supplementation of zinc, which we often get too little of in our diets and which supports the work of lymphocytes, that combination in high-risk people early, before they have symptoms warranting a consideration of hospitalization, makes a major difference. And in his paper in the American Journal of Epidemiology, and I'll provide the link, he cites a number of studies that show that benefit. And although these weren't randomized controlled intervention trials, they were controlled trials in some cases, and the magnitude of difference is not easily dismissed. So randomization helps protect against bias and confounding, and it can be very important. But when you see a massive difference in reasonably comparable groups, even in the absence of those careful controls, you can reach conclusions. And the conclusion that Professor Risch reaches is that there is a decisive advantage to the use of hydroxychloroquine plus either azithromycin or doxycycline plus potentially nutrient supplements, notably zinc, in high-risk people before they get too sick. Why high-risk people? Well, because there is a risk with hydroxychloroquine of QT interval lengthening and dangerous cardiac dysrhythmias. In order for there to be a net benefit from the use of hydroxychloroquine, the risk from the virus, if not effectively treated, has to be greater, and ideally much greater, than the risk of side effects from the medication. And Dr. Risch does a really good job, I think, in his article of explaining the numbers and showing that in these high-risk people, so people over 70, people over 80, people with serious chronic illness who get exposure to COVID, who have COVID, but who are not yet sick enough for there to be consideration of hospitalization, treatment with, and again, not hydroxychloroquine on its own, but in combination with either azithromycin or doxycycline and relevant nutrient supplements, notably zinc, there appears to be a massive benefit. And by the way, this ties in with the mechanism that is conjectured for that combination treatment, namely the suppression of viral replication. In contrast, remdesivir has not been shown to be beneficial when used early, and that makes sense because it's not a treatment that is designed to stop viral replication. It's actually a treatment directed at the immune system response. It tends to dampen down a hyperinflammatory response, and so people who get hospitalized and are at risk of dying of COVID, more often than not, deaths from COVID are not overload with the virus, but rather a cytokine storm, so the immune system overreacting. Remdesivir treats that. So it actually makes sense mechanistically that there could be an advantage of hydroxychloroquine in the right combination early, and remdesivir would be more likely to be beneficial late. Do we have the studies to answer these questions? Simple fact is we do not. We do not have studies, randomized trials of people at high risk of likely needing hospitalization after the development of symptoms from COVID, getting hydroxychloroquine in combination with either azithromycin or doxycycline, which is what all of the clinicians who've seen good results advocate for. We have had trials to see whether or not people develop symptoms at all, and we've had trials using hydroxychloroquine alone. And for the most part, we've had trials that answered those two questions. Did people develop symptoms at a different rate? And the answer was yes, but not statistically significant. So fewer people developed symptoms of COVID when using hydroxychloroquine than placebo, but it was a very small difference. But it wasn't limited to high-risk people. The outcome wasn't who winds up needing hospitalization or who winds up dying. And hydroxychloroquine was studied alone when all of the clinical arguments favor combining hydroxychloroquine with these other drugs. For that matter, we have limited evidence about the standalone use of azithromycin or doxycycline, or maybe those two in combination, or those with nutrient supplements. And that's because it takes time to run enough trials to answer every question. But then it's absolutely crucial that we front load with what we think are the most important questions. If mechanistically we think that hydroxychloroquine is most likely to work in combination with other drugs, we ought to test it in combination with other drugs. One of the reasons that's not being done is in epidemiologic research, we like to be precise about attribution. So if you combine A and B as a treatment and you get a result, was it A or was it B or was it both? You don't know. And we've all been taught in science, those of us who do research, to be reductionistic. You want to know, what was the active ingredient, A or B, an interaction between A or B? Okay, over time, you can study A alone, B alone, the combination. We don't have the luxury of time right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We want to save lives today. We want to save lives tomorrow. We wish we had saved more lives yesterday. And so anything that's likely to be effective is really important really fast. And if we are more confident about the combination of A plus B being effective, we should test that. We can sort out later whether A alone works, B alone works, or you get a benefit from combining the two. But that's the clinical question. The combination of hydroxychloroquine and either azithromycin or doxycycline, with or without the addition of select nutrient supplements, notably 30 milligrams of zinc, early after exposure in high-risk patients, does it reduce the risk of hospitalization and death? That's the relevant question. We do not have decisive studies to answer it, but Dr. Risch summarizes the evidence suggesting that there is a potentially very large benefit there. On the other hand, using hydroxychloroquine later to treat the cytokine storm appears to be ineffective, and that's the conclusion that's been reached by the FDA, by the federal authorities in the United States, and they're correct. And again, that's rooted in mechanism. If this drug combination works, it works by suppressing viral replication. That makes sense, but that's the problem relatively early in the disease. It would have almost no impact on the cytokine storm which is the life-threatening problem late in the disease. And conversely, remdesivir would do almost nothing to viral replication. That's not the kind of drug it is. It's a drug that interferes with biochemical pathways that amplify the immune system response, so it makes perfect sense that it would be effective at ameliorating the cytokine storm and the late stage consequences in people who are hospitalized. So, until we have asked all the right questions and directed research to answer them, we have to make do with the best available evidence, and that's not going to be a double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trial in every instance. We do not have that evidence yet. This then becomes an important time to note that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Until you study the relevant clinical question and generate a decisive answer to it, you have to conclude that you're not sure. And then you do what clinicians have always done, which is use the best available evidence, imperfect though it may be, to optimize the chances of every patient having a good outcome. I think the weight of evidence so far in favor of hydroxychloroquine in combination with either azithromycin or doxycycline and select nutrients in high-risk patients after exposure to COVID with detected COVID, but without severe enough symptoms to warrant consideration of hospitalization, looks good. If I have a loved one in that category, I would be inclined to make use of this treatment. So it's a very select population. It's targeted use, but it makes sense. I certainly favor the use of remdesivir in more advanced cases in the hospital. It's also clear that dexamethasone, a steroid, is warranted in that situation. It's also clear that drugs to prevent blood clots. So there are a lot of subtleties to the clinical management of COVID that have emerged. But I think the critical issue here is to consider that the answers we generate in clinical trials can never be better than the questions we pose. And until we have turned all of the right questions into research protocols, there's going to be uncertain evidence that's going to need to be interpreted. And here, as in everything related to the pandemic, it's not really all that helpful if we gravitate to extreme positions and either say hydroxychloroquine in the water supply or hydroxychloroquine is categorically useless for everybody all the time. I just know. We're hearing a lot of both. As best I can tell, both are wrong. There is an argument for judicious use of this drug in the right context, in the right combination, for the right patients, but it's not a panacea. And if we can deal with that nuance, there's a good chance we can save more lives.